Kevin Jones, who's former professor of music at Kingston University, and he shares Elgar's love of codes and enigmas. Kevin, we've just heard the Enigma variations. What do you think it is about that piece in particular that so captivates audiences?
Well, I think there are three things really which relate to this. I think one is Elgar had this very sensitive character. I mean, now we're realising there's a much more nuanced view of Elgar's character. He isn't the stuffy old colonel type with the big moustache that folk have sometimes been to think of thought of him in the past. But he was a very sensitive soul, had these great mood swings, but there were extraordinary sides to his character. And one of those, I think, because he was such a sensitive soul, he had this great empathy with other people. And I think that's what's coming out in these variations, that you can really see how he gets inside the skin of these friends. He wasn't trying to actually do portraits of them. He was trying to write the sort of music that they would have written had they been composers. And it's a super range of different styles and approaches that he manages to get there. I think the other thing is that the actual Enigma melody itself is short notes to long notes, da 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 da, and then exactly the same thing swapped around. It's repeated. It's mirror image, da 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 da, and that's repeated 3 times. It's the sort of symmetry that a modernist composer in the 20th century, like Messiaen or Webern, would have been proud.
Well, Elgar was tremendously ahead of his time, wasn't he?
In many
he was
respects,
a true Victorian man.
That's right. He was very keen on science, and particularly in chemistry.
As you told me, he particularly liked creating smells.
That's right.
In what way?
If you look through some of his old chemistry textbooks, it's quite strange that it's all the stuff that makes the worst smells that he's highlighted. And he got into trouble. He had a chemistry laboratory in his basement in one of his houses, and it's known that he created rather too many smells. I think probably wasn't appreciated by his wife Alice. But in another house that he moved to, he had a purpose-built, well, a converted area which he called his Ark, which was a fully kitted out laboratory. There are all sorts of interesting stories of when he talks about certain chemicals falling into certain scores, and a great episode of when he created an explosion which resounded through the whole neighbourhood and created quite a stir.
So he was quite a practical joker. But where did this love of codes and cryptography come from?
Well, I mean, going back to what you were saying about the particularly interesting characteristic of that relates to the Enigma melody. It was so strange. It just didn't sound like a normal melody. And I think that's what makes the variations work so successfully, because you've got this extraordinary symmetry where you've got one motive answered by its reverse, the same repeated again a little bit higher, and then it almost forms like a Gothic window. And it's so distinctive that when he comes to do his variations, you can always hear that in the background, and it helps bind the whole thing together.
Because there are puzzles within puzzles. I mean, the first one, which is quite obvious to solve, which you mentioned, which James mentioned earlier, is that it was the initials of Elgar's friends which were given to each of the variations.
That's right, yes.
But the second puzzle, which is more mysterious, is that there was a theme which goes but is not heard. And what's that?
That's right. Now, there are some people who reckon, because in the original program note, the reference to a theme could be interpreted as just a sort of general idea. But actually, there are plenty of other records which do suggest that it was definitely a matching melody. There was an interview published with him in the Musical Times the year after he wrote Variations in 1900, where the writer explicitly refers to another phrase, a very well-known phrase, which can be put above the original theme. But what that theme is,
people have suggested it's Auld Lang Syne or the national anthem, but you discount those, do you?
Yeah, well, Elgar himself discounted those. He was asked by some of his friends, suggested these, and he specifically ruled them out.
But he also knew Morse code, didn't he?
Yes,
I mean, we're familiar with Barrington Furlong's theme for the Inspector Morse series, which allegedly had these kind of mysterious codes in it. But Elgar was way ahead of that, wasn't he?
Well, Elgar knew Morse code, and we also know that some of his friends, Dora Bella of the Variations, knew Morse code. And I have a theory that there's Morse code in the original Enigma melody. If you interpret the 2 dots as an I and the 2 dashes as an M, you reverse that, you get I, M, M, I, which is like I am I?
So really, I mean, as I was, saying just a few minutes ago about Elgar being fiercely criticised, I mean, really, he's blowing a big raspberry and saying, well, I am lightweight, am I?
Yes, that's right. It's clear at the time he wrote these variations from things that he reported later, the way that he quoted this material in later works like The Music Makers. He wrote this at a time when he was feeling pretty low, and his he started it at a time when he was feeling pretty low, and some of his friends do suggest that he was clearly deeply hurt by some biting criticism at some stage, and he always seemed to have a bit of a chip on his shoulder. The fact he was a Roman Catholic at a time when Roman Catholics were really rather seen as sort of a bit on the edge, and his background was fairly modest, and so some people said some very unkind things to him.
But the music aside, I mean, there is another code which has all the makings of a blockbuster novel, and you can forget the Da Vinci Code. I mean, this actually happened,
right?
And that's the Dora Bella which you mentioned, or the Dora Penny Code.
Yes. Now, Dora Penny was the name of this young friend that he sent. Dora Bella was the nickname that he used for her in the variations. So it's known as the Dora Bella Code,
and I think we can actually see that on screen
or the Dora
now,
Bella
yes.
cipher.
And I mean, to me, that looks like just maggots or squiggles. But
yeah, well, somebody described it, a sort of book on code breaking. They described it as a flock of sheep,
right?
Wandering flock of sheep, and it's tackled some of the best brains in cryptography for many years.
Well, 100 years.
That's right. Well, it was first published. Dora Penny published it in a book. She was by then known as Dora Powell, which was published under her husband's name, Richard Powell, in the 1940s.
Well, Kevin, you've written extensive notes on cryptology and music, which can be read on our website, which is bbc.co.uk/proms. And there you can also peruse the Dora Bella cipher at your leisure. And if you solve it, of course, we would love to hear from you. We would love to hear from you anyway. Susie, back to